Greetings wargamers, today I'm going to be making a fantasy building as quickly as possible. Ever since I got my hands on the Green Stuff World rollers, I've wanted to see how much they can speed up the process of making fantasy buildings. So I decided to put it to the test in a speed build and see if I could make something as quickly as possible. So let's head over to the bench and see what I came up with. I had only the vaguest idea of a plan when I began this project. I knew I wanted to incorporate the Green Stuff World rollers, but that was about all I knew. I began by ripping down a sheet of 6mm extruded polystyrene to a more manageable size. My original plan was to roll out a section of texture across the entire piece and then use the hot wire cutter to miter the corners. Rolling the texture on something this large in one continuous go is much harder than I expected. Maintaining pressure so the entire piece was evenly textured was nearly impossible. So I got another piece of foam, this time 10mm so I could apply a bit more pressure, and I rough cut the shapes to the walls. I applied texture to these individually after failing to stick them together with cocktail sticks. With the texture applied, I mitered the corners to 45 degrees on my hot wire cutter, and here's where the problems really started. The edges of the pieces just looked so jagged and messy and didn't line up at all because of the texture. My entire plan so far had hinged on using mitered corners to speed up the process, so when this failed I had a moment of panic. Not to be deterred, I pushed on and decided to cut away the miters and build the structure with butt joints. I textured the other side of each piece so as not to waste too much polystyrene, and then used hot glue to connect the walls. Normally for projects like this I use PVA glue for all of my joins, but as the point of this whole experiment was to do it as quickly as possible, I used hot glue. The hot glue worked incredibly well. Using small amounts applied evenly across the join, I was able to hold the two connecting pieces in place for a few moments and then immediately move on to the next step. A couple of times I touched the foam with the hot tip of the gun which deformed it, but otherwise it worked perfectly. For large sheets that need to be glued flat I would still use another glue, but I think hot glue will become my main adhesive for structures going forward because of how quick it makes things. With the walls all assembled I needed to hide those butt joint seams. Normally I would use balsa wood for this, but I had some very thin offcuts of foam left over from squaring off my original stock, so I cut that to size, used a wire brush to add some texture, and hot glued them in place onto the ends of the buildings. Next I began work on the door. After changing directions with how the building was being put together, the final structure was much smaller than intended, so I decided to turn the building into a crypt or a mausoleum. I made a stone archway using my hot wire table to cut the general shape, and then traced that shape onto some 6mm foam to use for the door. I drew on some wood grain with a ballpoint pen and used a wire brush to add some texture. After cleaning up the archway a little bit, I used hot glue to put the door in place within the arch, and then glued the whole thing to the building. The arch stood a little proud for my taste, so I cut it down on my hot wire table, and I also cleaned up the angle of the roof at the same time. To make the roof substructure, I cut two pieces of 6mm foam, with one piece being 6mm wider than the other, so that when they were put together, they would be the correct width on both sides. I used dressmaking pins to hold both sides together, and then hot glued the roof structure into place. At this point, I was quite unhappy with the building overall, and I actually considered scrapping the whole project. But after a short break, I came back and I decided that what I was unhappy with was the balance of the piece. So I added some additional wooden beams to the sides so that they weren't just on the front and the back of the building, and this really evened everything out and made all the difference. The part of the entire build that took the longest once again was the roof. Even cutting the shingles square and adding no extra details, this step still took as long as the rest of the building combined. I plan on doing an entire video looking at roofing materials and ways to speed up this step, so if you have suggestions on roofing materials, post them in the comments. I added the shingles using hot glue, which again saved a lot of time versus using PVA glue, and then with the roof added it was time to work on the base. I used a jigsaw to rough cut some 6mm MDF, and then used my scroll saw to get it down to the final shape. You could use the jigsaw for the entire process by setting the angle of your saw, but I prefer the precision of my scroll saw. I set my angle to 20 degrees, but I think in future I'll go for something more like 40 to get a softer lip. I glued the building to the base with hot glue and immediately moved on to basing, brushing undiluted PVA glue all around the base, then sprinkling some small slate pieces against the building, and then using a mix of fine and coarse sand all over the remainder of the base. And here is the final result. The whole building took about 3 hours, but a lot of that was spent wrestling with trying to make those mitered corners work, and then making the roof. If I were to make this building again exactly the same, I think I could get that down to about 2 hours of build time. The biggest eye-opener for me on this project was just how useful hot glue is. I've never really used it in my terrain projects, I've always been a PVA glue loyalist, but especially on a project like this, the drying time is really a deal breaker. Hot glue allowed me to set 2 pieces together and almost immediately move on. Overall, I'm really pleased with how this piece came out. I was unsure as to how it would turn out for a little while there, but I'm really glad that I persevered with it. It's a nice little line of sight blocking terrain, and if paired with the gravestones that I've made in a previous video, it would make a really nice feature on the table. That's all for this week, folks. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do, and until next time, happy gaming. Thanks for watching. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below for new content every single Friday. And if you want to keep watching, well, there's another couple videos for you to watch just over there. Happy gaming.